One man brought the mighty Roman Republic to the brink of collapse. For 15 years, Hannibal Barca, a Carthaginian general, waged a personal war against Rome, crossing the Alps with elephants and winning battles that became legends. By the end of this story, you will understand the mind of a military genius and why his strategic brilliance remains the ultimate case study in how to outthink a superpower. How did a commander with no supply lines nearly destroy Rome on its own soil? And what fatal flaw in his grand plan allowed his enemies to survive and conquer? When you think of a single person challenging an entire empire, what does that tell you about the power of a bold idea? But before Hannibal could cross a single mountain, his entire world was shaped by a conflict he was born into. The Mediterranean of his youth was not a peaceful sea. It was a chessboard where two great powers, Carthage and Rome, were locked in a slow, grinding struggle for control. Carthage was the established maritime empire, a trading giant whose wealth flowed from ports across North Africa and distant coasts. Rome was the relentless newcomer, a land power with a disciplined army and an ambition that knew no bounds. Their first great clash, the First Punic War, was a brutal 23-year struggle fought mostly over the island of Sicily. It ended in a way that shocked the Mediterranean world. The mighty Carthage, for centuries the dominant naval force, was defeated. The terms were harsh. Carthage was forced to abandon Sicily and pay Rome a staggering war debt, an indemnity of silver that would take decades to settle. For the proud citizens of Carthage, especially its military aristocracy, this was not just a loss, it was a deep, festering national humiliation. And in one Carthaginian household, this humiliation was felt most personally. A general named Hamilcar Barca had fought with distinction in Sicily, yet he returned home to see his city forced into a position of subservience. The story goes that before leaving for Spain to rebuild Carthaginian fortunes, he took his young son, Hannibal, to a temple. There he made the boy place his hand upon a sacrifice and swear an oath to never be a friend to Rome. Whether this moment happened exactly as told is less important than the truth it represents. Hannibal grew up in a climate of simmering resentment, raised by a father who saw Rome not as a rival, but as an existential threat that must one day be confronted again. This was the fuel for the fire. The First Punic War created the debt and the bitterness. Hamilcar Barca provided the purpose and the plan, and Hannibal inherited it all, a personal vendetta fused with a strategic necessity, setting a course that would lead to one of the most audacious military campaigns in history. That oath in the temple was not a childhood fantasy. It was a curriculum. Hannibal's entire youth was an apprenticeship in the art of war, conducted not in quiet classrooms but in the dusty, demanding reality of his father's campaign tents in Iberia, what we know today as Spain. This was a brutal proving ground. Hamilcar Barca was there to rebuild Carthage's wealth and power, securing silver mines and subduing local tribes, and he brought his son along for every grueling step. From a very young age, Hannibal learned command by watching his father. He learned logistics by seeing how an army moves, feeds itself, and survives far from home. Most crucially, he learned the delicate art of motivating an army that was not a single, homogeneous force. The Carthaginian military was a tapestry of different peoples: North African cavalry, Iberian swordsmen, Balearic slingers, each with their own language, customs, and reasons for fighting. Hannibal absorbed it all. He reportedly became fluent in several languages, not as a scholar, but as a commander who needed to look a soldier in the eye and be understood. This was the foundation of his legendary charisma. He did not just give orders, he built loyalty. By the time his brother-in-law, Hasdrubal, who had taken command after Hamilcar's passing, was lost to violence, the army did not hesitate. They unanimously proclaimed the 26-year-old Hannibal as their leader. He was not an untested heir, he was the most qualified person in the camp. His first actions as commander proved this political shrewdness. He immediately launched campaigns to secure the rest of Iberia, not just through force, but through a mix of diplomacy and decisive action. He married a local princess to cement an alliance. He dealt with rebellious tribes swiftly, sending a clear message about Carthaginian authority, while rewarding those who cooperated. These were not the actions of a hot-headed avenger, but of a calculating strategist securing his rear and his resources. He knew that to challenge Rome, he needed a solid base, loyal troops, and the silver from Spanish mines to fund his war. Every move was a preparation. He was studying his enemy, too, analyzing the rigid, predictable structure of the Roman legion. He saw its power, but he also began to see its potential weaknesses. When the moment finally came, triggered by a dispute over the city of Saguntum, Hannibal was not starting a war on a whim. He was executing a plan decades in the making. He had the army, the funding, the loyalty, and a deep, intimate understanding of the giant he was about to provoke. The question was no longer if he would march on Rome, but how he would possibly get there. The decision was a thunderbolt of strategic defiance. Hannibal chose the impossible route, turning the very geography of Europe into his weapon. In the autumn of 218 BC, with his army of tens of thousands of men, horses, and 37 war elephants, he did not sail for Italy. He turned north away from the sea and began a march toward the snow-capped barrier of the Alps. To the Roman Senate, comfortably debating in the Forum, this was unthinkable. The Alps were not just mountains, they were a natural fortress wall, a place of myth and peril where civilized armies did not go. By choosing this path, Hannibal achieved his first and perhaps greatest victory before a single Roman legionary was in sight, the victory of complete psychological surprise. He vanished from their calculations, reappearing where he was never supposed to be. The reality of the crossing, however, was a brutal testament to human and animal endurance. Visualize a narrow, winding path carved into a mountainside, slick with ice and loose scree. Men, many of whom had never seen snow, slipped and fell. Pack animals lost their footing. The local Gallic tribes, far from welcoming, launched ambushes from the high cliffs, rolling boulders down onto the vulnerable column below. The cold was a relentless enemy, and the thin air at high passes made every step a labor. Then there were the elephants. How do you persuade a multi-ton creature, built for the heat of Africa or India, to climb an icy Alpine pass? The accounts suggest incredible ingenuity, perhaps clearing wider paths or using food to coax them, but the hardship for these animals was profound. Each day was a battle against the elements, against terrain, and against despair. Yet this was not a blind trek into a frozen wilderness. It was a calculated gamble where every loss was weighed against a greater gain. Hannibal knew the sea was controlled by the Roman fleet, making a naval landing a risky proposition. He knew that arriving in northern Italy from the landward side would shock Rome and instantly rally any Gallic tribes who resented Roman rule. Most importantly, he was moving the entire theater of war. He was not going to fight for some distant province. He was bringing the fire directly to Rome's doorstep. After 15 days of unimaginable struggle, the ragged Carthaginian army emerged from the high passes. Hannibal, it is said, gathered his exhausted men and pointed down to the green, fertile plains of Italy stretching out below them. They had done it. They had crossed the uncrossable. But the cost was staggering. Perhaps half of the army that had left Spain was gone, lost to the cold, the falls, or the skirmishes. Yet the army that remained was now something more than a fighting force. It was a legend in the making, hardened by shared suffering and utterly loyal to the commander who had led them through it. The Roman plan to fight the war in Spain or Africa was now irrelevant. The war was here, the chessboard had been flipped over, and Hannibal had just made his opening move. The green plains of Italy were not a sanctuary, they were a proving ground. Hannibal's hardened survivors now faced a new test, the first clash with the full might of Rome on its own soil. The Roman Senate, finally grasping the scale of the threat, dispatched two consular armies. One consul, Publius Cornelius Scipio, had already skirmished with Hannibal's cavalry. The other, Tiberius Sempronius Longus, was summoned from Sicily, burning with ambition and a dangerous desire for a quick, glorious victory. Hannibal understood this Roman mindset perfectly. He chose his ground with the care of a hunter. The Trebia River, swollen with winter rains and bitingly cold, became the centerpiece of his trap. He positioned his main army on the western bank and sent his Numidian cavalry, masters of hit-and-run tactics, to harass the Roman camp at dawn, provoking Sempronius into action. The Roman consul took the bait entirely. He ordered his men, who had not even eaten breakfast, to march through the icy waist-deep water of the Trebia to meet the Carthaginian force on the far side. The Roman legionaries emerged from the river numb, exhausted and shivering, their muscles stiff with cold, their formation disrupted. As the two main lines crashed together in a brutal slog, Hannibal sprung the rest of his plan. His brother Mago, with a hand-picked force of infantry and cavalry, had been concealed overnight in a watercourse hidden by brush, lying in wait behind the Roman position. At the critical moment, they surged from their hiding place and struck the Roman rear. Simultaneously, Hannibal's fierce war elephants, which had survived the Alps, plowed into the Roman flanks. The legions, wet, cold, and now surrounded, were thrown into panic. Their discipline shattered. A large portion of the Roman army was lost that day, either in the fighting or to the freezing river during their desperate retreat. The Battle of the Trebia was not merely a victory, it was a statement. Hannibal had demonstrated a complete mastery of what modern strategists call the operational art. He manipulated his enemy's commander like a puppet, using Sempronius's own aggression against him. He weaponized the environment, turning the river and the cold into additional soldiers in his army. And he executed a complex, multi-layered plan with perfect timing, proving the Roman legion was not invincible. The precedent was set in blood and ice. Rome now knew it was facing a mind unlike any other, a commander who could turn the very landscape and the assumptions of his opponents into instruments of their own defeat. The shock of Trebia demanded a Roman response, and it came in the form of a new consul, Gaius Flaminius. He was a man of the people, a populist leader known for his boldness and his deep disdain for what he saw as the Senate's cautious aristocracy. Flaminius took command of a fresh army and marched north to block Hannibal's advance, burning with the desire to be the man who saved the Republic. Hannibal, reading his opponent's character like an open scroll, saw not a threat but an opportunity. He began to move south, deliberately ravaging the countryside of Etruria, the very region Flaminius had championed in his political career. It was a calculated insult, a personal provocation designed to goad the proud consul into a reckless pursuit. And it worked perfectly. Flaminius, his pride wounded and eager for a decisive battle, abandoned his strong defensive position and pushed his legions hard to catch the Carthaginian army. He was chasing a ghost into a carefully prepared grave. Hannibal had chosen his ground with a sculptor's precision. The northern shore of Lake Trasimene offered a narrow coastal road, pinched between steep, wooded hills and the water's edge. It was a natural defile, a perfect bottle. As dusk fell, Hannibal positioned his entire army, infantry, cavalry, and light troops in concealed positions along the tree line of the hills overlooking the road. They spent a cold, silent night waiting, hidden from view. The next morning brought a thick, clinging fog that rolled off the lake, blanketing the landscape in a ghostly white shroud. It was the final element of the trap. Flaminius, confident he was in a rapid pursuit, ordered his army to march into the narrow pass in a long, dense column, their vision reduced to a few feet in the mist. They had no scouts ahead, no flanking parties on the hills. They were walking blind into a prepared slaughter. At Hannibal's signal, the silence of the hills shattered. From the fog on three sides, Carthaginian warriors poured down the slopes. The attack was not a single clash of lines. It was a sudden, overwhelming onslaught from everywhere at once. The Romans, trapped between the lake and the enemy, had no room to form their famous battle lines, no room to retreat. The fog that had hidden Hannibal's army now magnified the panic as disoriented legionaries were cut down by shapes emerging from the gloom. The fighting was brutal and compressed into a chaotic, bloody struggle along the shoreline. Within 3 hours it was over. The Roman army was effectively annihilated. Gaius Flaminius himself was lost in the combat. It was one of the most devastating ambushes in military history. Lake Trasimene was more than a battle. It was psychological warfare executed on a grand scale. Hannibal had used the terrain as a weapon, the weather as an ally, and his enemy's own temperament as the trigger. The news that reached Rome was not of a defeat, but of a catastrophe. For the first time, a true, paralyzing fear settled over the city. The road south now lay open, and the man who had orchestrated this disaster was moving steadily toward them. The fear that gripped Rome after Trasimene was now a cold, hard resolve. The Republic abandoned its usual system of rotating consuls for a desperate measure, appointing a seasoned veteran, Lucius Aemilius Paulus, and a more aggressive commander, Gaius Terentius Varro, to lead a single, massive new army. Their mandate was simple and brutal: find Hannibal and crush him with overwhelming force. They assembled a force of unprecedented size. Some ancient sources suggest as many as 80,000 men, a colossal tide of Roman citizen soldiers determined to end this nightmare. The two generals, however, embodied a fatal division. Paulus favored caution and open ground, while Varro, eager for a public victory, craved a decisive battle. Hannibal, ever the master of reading his opponents, would exploit this rift not with whispers, but with the landscape itself. He seized control of a crucial grain depot at Cannae in southeastern Italy, forcing the massive Roman army to come to him on ground of his choosing. The stage was set for a confrontation that would define military strategy for millennia. On a hot, dusty morning in August of 216 BC, the two armies deployed on the flat plain near the Aufidus River. The Roman force was a breathtaking sight, a deep, dense block of legionaries designed to push forward with irresistible weight, its flanks protected by cavalry. Hannibal arranged his outnumbered men with the precision of a master chess player. He formed his infantry center in a wide, shallow arc, a convex bulge pointing toward the Romans. This center was deliberately composed of his Gallic and Iberian troops, fierce fighters but less experienced. On either side of this bulge, hidden slightly behind, stood his elite African infantry, veterans he had trained for years, now armed with captured Roman weapons. His cavalry, his greatest asset, was split on the wings. The plan was a work of deceptive geometry. As the battle commenced, the Roman juggernaut did exactly what Hannibal anticipated. It drove straight into the inviting, bulging center of his line. The Gallic and Iberian warriors fought fiercely but began to give ground slowly in a controlled, planned retreat. To the Romans, it appeared their overwhelming force was winning, pushing the Carthaginian center back. But with every step forward, they were funneling themselves deeper into a carefully crafted pocket. The convex bulge of Hannibal's line began to flatten, then to invert, becoming a concave bowl that cradled the advancing Romans. At this precise moment, the symphony reached its crescendo. Hannibal's cavalry, having routed their Roman counterparts on the wings, did not pursue. Instead, they wheeled inward and slammed into the rear of the Roman infantry mass. Simultaneously, the veteran African infantry on the flanks turned inward and advanced, pinching the sides. In a matter of moments, the Roman army was completely surrounded, pressed together so tightly that men could not raise their arms to wield their swords. The battle dissolved into a grim, systematic event. Hannibal had not just defeated the Roman army, he had erased it. The scale of the loss is almost beyond comprehension. Perhaps 50,000 Roman and allied soldiers lost in a single afternoon. It was the perfect battle, the double envelopment, a tactical masterpiece executed with chilling efficiency. Cannae was not merely a victory, it was the pinnacle of operational art, where every element of command, terrain, psychology, and timing fused into a single, devastating whole. For Rome, it was the abyss. For military thinkers forever after, it became the ultimate lesson in how to destroy an enemy not by meeting their strength, but by inviting it in and then removing all space for it to exist. Yet this tactical masterpiece at Cannae would have been impossible without a deeper, more human form of genius. Hannibal's true strategic weapon was not the shape of his battle line, but the spirit of the men who held it. Consider the extraordinary challenge he faced. His was not a national army of citizen soldiers bound by patriotism. It was a mosaic of hired professionals and allied contingents: Libyan spearmen, Numidian horsemen, Iberian swordsmen, Gallic warriors, each speaking different languages, honoring different gods, and fighting for different reasons. To hold such a force together for 15 years on hostile soil, through Alpine snows and Italian summers, required something far beyond tactical skill. It required a masterclass in the psychology of command. Hannibal understood that loyalty is not bought with coin alone. He built it through shared experience and visible fairness. He famously slept in the open among his men, wrapped in the same rough cloak. He ate the same simple rations. When the army forded an icy river, he was the first to wade in. When they built a camp, he took his turn at the watch. This was not a performance, it was a principle. He led from the front, sharing every danger, which meant his soldiers knew their suffering was also his. But shared hardship only goes so far. Hannibal also mastered the practical economics of motivation. Plunder from captured Roman towns and supply depots was not hoarded by the officers, it was distributed with a visible equity. Every soldier could see that his service translated directly into reward, that his general was not just a commander but a guarantor of their collective fortune. This created a powerful, self-reinforcing bond. The men fought for Carthage, yes, but more immediately they fought for Hannibal and for each other. This forged a resilience that defied logic. After Cannae, when most of southern Italy defected to his cause, Hannibal's army did not dissolve into looting or factional strife. It remained a coherent instrument of his will, capable of marching, maneuvering, and fighting on command. That cohesion, that unbreakable trust between a general and his polyglot army, was the invisible foundation upon which every battlefield victory was built. It was the strategic asset that allowed him to live off the land in Italy for over a decade, never facing a mass desertion or a serious mutiny. While Rome could raise new legions from its citizenry, Hannibal had to preserve the one irreplaceable army he had. He did not just command it, he became its living, breathing soul. A victory like Cannae demanded a new kind of defeat. Rome could not beat Hannibal in the open field, so it had to change the very nature of the war. In the wake of that staggering loss, the Senate turned to a man whose temperament was the opposite of every consul who had fallen before. Quintus Fabius Maximus was not a firebrand. He was a patient, calculating survivor who understood that to save the Republic, he must first stop trying to conquer its greatest enemy. His strategy was so simple it seemed like cowardice, and so brilliant it saved a nation. He would not fight Hannibal, he would starve him. Fabius was given a dictator's power, and he used it to impose a glacial, frustrating new reality on the campaign. The Roman legions would shadow Hannibal's army like a persistent, haunting ghost. They would occupy the high ground, control the mountain passes, and cut off his foraging parties. When Hannibal offered battle, arraying his men on favorable ground, Fabius would simply refuse to descend. He turned the Italian countryside itself into a vast, silent ally, denying Hannibal the decisive clashes that fed his momentum and his legend. To a populace and a military aristocracy raised on the glory of direct confrontation, this was intolerable. They branded Fabius with the nickname Cunctator, the Delayer, a title meant as an insult that history would remember as a badge of honor. This war of attrition was built on a cold, logical truth that earlier Roman commanders had been too proud to see. Hannibal's army was a masterpiece of mobile, operational genius, but it had critical limitations. He lacked the heavy siege engines needed to storm Rome's massive walls. Every allied city that defected to him became a new responsibility to garrison and protect, slowly stretching his finite forces thinner. Most importantly, his polyglot army was irreplaceable. Every horseman, every veteran African spearman lost was a wound that could not be healed from the resources of Italy. Rome, in contrast, could draw on a vast reservoir of citizen manpower. Fabius's strategy aimed to exchange what Rome had in abundance, time and men, for what Hannibal could not afford to lose, his seasoned corps of soldiers. It was a brutal calculus of patience over pride. The psychological strain of this approach was immense. As Hannibal marched through the richest lands of Italy, burning estates and taunting the Roman army from a distance, the public outcry grew. They wanted a hero, not a shadow. When Fabius's term ended, political pressure forced a return to the old ways, leading directly to another costly Roman defeat. This only proved Fabius right. Slowly, reluctantly, his doctrine became the unspoken foundation of all Roman strategy. They began to fight the war not where Hannibal was, but where he was not, recapturing rebellious cities and securing regions while their main armies continued to avoid his direct grasp. Hannibal remained undefeated in battle, yet he found himself trapped in a slowly tightening net, his brilliant victories becoming strategic islands in a rising sea of Roman resolve. The genius of Cannae had finally met its counter, not in a general but in a grim, unwavering philosophy of survival. The shadow of Cannae was long, but it did not reach the walls of Rome. Hannibal had achieved the unthinkable, shattering the Republic's army and standing unopposed in the heart of Italy. Yet, in that moment of supreme tactical triumph, his greatest strategic weakness was laid bare. He possessed an army of unmatched skill, but he could not replace it. Rome, in its darkest hour, revealed a different kind of power, a deep, resilient strength that was not in its generals, but in its very structure. While Hannibal's force was a brilliant, sharpened blade, Rome was the entire forge, and it could make new blades faster than he could break them. This fundamental mismatch created a paradox. Hannibal was everywhere victorious, yet he was slowly, inexorably losing the war. He became a contained storm, a force of immense power roaming the countryside of southern Italy, winning skirmishes and persuading cities like Capua to defect, but unable to translate those victories into a final, decisive act. The reason was a brutal equation of logistics. The Roman navy controlled the sea lanes between Italy and Carthage. Fresh troops, supplies, and official support from his home government could only arrive in trickles, if at all. Every cavalryman lost in a minor engagement, every veteran spearman who fell to illness, was a permanent subtraction from his fighting strength. His army was not just fighting the Romans, it was slowly wearing itself out against the relentless tide of Roman resilience. Meanwhile, Rome simply refused to play by his rules anymore. They adopted the Fabian strategy not as a temporary retreat, but as a permanent state of being. They avoided pitched battles, focusing instead on recapturing the cities that had joined Hannibal, systematically dismantling his network of allies. They fought the war where he was not, stretching his limited forces even thinner as he rushed from one crisis to another. Hannibal found himself in a strategic trap of his own making. He was too powerful to be defeated in the field, but without the means to siege Rome itself, he lacked the tool to end the conflict. He became a magnificent, feared presence, a legend that haunted Italy for over a decade. Yet he was also a prisoner of his own success, waiting for a reinforcement that would never come in sufficient force, and for a political collapse in Rome that its stubborn citizens would never permit. Hannibal's victories on the battlefield were undeniable, but his strategy depended on a political earthquake that never arrived. He had wagered everything on a single, powerful assumption that the sheer shock of his military success would shatter the political bonds holding Rome's Italian confederation together. After all, Rome was not yet a monolithic empire. It was the leading city in a complex alliance of states, many of whom had been conquered by the legions in living memory. Hannibal believed that after a demonstration like Cannae, these so-called allies would see their chance for freedom and flock to his banner, isolating Rome completely. For a moment, it seemed his gamble would pay off. The great city of Capua, the second richest in Italy, threw open its gates to him, offering a winter headquarters, fresh troops, and immense prestige. Other important towns in the south, like Tarentum, would later follow. Yet this was the high watermark of his political revolution. The widespread, cascading collapse he needed simply did not happen. The core of the Confederation, the communities of central Italy, remained stubbornly, bafflingly loyal to the very power that had subjugated them. Why? The answer reveals a profound miscalculation in Hannibal's grand design. He understood the mechanics of armies, but he misread the architecture of Roman power. Rome's hold was not maintained solely through fear of the legions. It was reinforced by a web of tangible benefits. Loyal allies shared in the spoils of Rome's earlier conquests. They enjoyed protected trade routes, and their local elites were often granted a degree of autonomy and even Roman citizenship for their families. Defecting to Hannibal meant gambling on an unpredictable foreign general against a system that, for all its demands, had provided stability and profit for generations. Furthermore, Hannibal's own army, living off the land, often alienated the very people he hoped to liberate. Foraging to feed 50,000 men inevitably meant taking food from local farms, blurring the line between liberation and occupation in the eyes of the populace. So while Hannibal won every major battle, he could not win the narrative. He offered freedom, but Rome offered a vested interest in the existing order. This left him in a strategic limbo. He was powerful enough to dominate the countryside, yet without the widespread political defections, he lacked the sustained local infrastructure, the steady supply of fresh Italian recruits, and the secure bases needed to finally threaten the city of Rome itself. He had broken the Roman army, but he could not break the Roman system. His dazzling tactical genius found itself checkmated by a slower, deeper, and ultimately more resilient form of power. The loyalty of those who had decided that Rome, for all its faults, was still a better bet than the brilliant stranger camped outside their walls. The war for Italy was only one act in a much larger, sprawling conflict. While Hannibal's legendary army moved like a storm across the peninsula, a brutal and decisive struggle was unfolding 1,000 miles to the west in the sun-baked hills of Iberia. This land was not a secondary theater, it was the very foundation of Hannibal's entire enterprise. The silver mines here funded his campaign, the ports supplied his army, and the local tribes provided a steady stream of fierce warriors. Control of Iberia meant Hannibal could, in theory, fight forever. Recognizing this, Rome made a brilliant and ruthless strategic pivot. They could not defeat Hannibal directly in Italy, so they set out to dismantle the platform that made his war possible. Two Roman brothers, Gnaeus and Publius Scipio, were dispatched with an army not to seek glory in a climactic battle, but to wage a war of relentless, grinding attrition. For years, they campaigned along the eastern coast, forging alliances with local chieftains, capturing key towns, and systematically severing the arteries that connected Carthaginian Spain to Hannibal in Italy. Their goal was simple: tie down Carthaginian forces and choke off the flow of men and money heading east. They succeeded brilliantly. For over a decade, critical Carthaginian armies, which could have turned the tide in Italy, were instead locked in a draining stalemate on the Iberian front, fighting to protect the family treasury. This was the unseen, unglamorous work that truly undermined Hannibal's war. Then, in a cruel twist of fate, both Scipio brothers fell in battle, their armies scattered. In this moment of crisis, Rome did something extraordinary. They turned to the son of the fallen Publius Scipio, a young man in his mid-20s bearing his father's name. What he lacked in experience, he made up for in a revolutionary understanding of warfare. Publius Cornelius Scipio, who would later be known as Africanus, did not see Iberia as a problem to be managed, but as the key to ending the entire war. He arrived not to continue a holding action, but to conquer. With a boldness that echoed Hannibal himself, Scipio audaciously captured the major Carthaginian supply base of Nova Carthago, modern-day Cartagena, in a single lightning strike. He then turned to the heart of Carthaginian power on the peninsula. The decisive clash came at Ilipa. There, Scipio faced a larger Carthaginian force and, in a masterstroke, inverted Hannibal's own tactics from Cannae. He weakened his center and strengthened his wings, orchestrating a complex maneuver that enveloped and crushed the enemy. It was a complete and devastating victory. With the Battle of Ilipa, Roman control of Iberia was sealed. The silver mines, the ports, the recruiting grounds, every strategic asset that had fueled Hannibal's 15-year campaign were suddenly gone. Cut off, the brilliant general in Italy was now a stranded masterpiece, a work of tactical art slowly fading on a distant canvas. The Roman victory in Iberia revealed a profound strategic truth. A war is not won by a single general, no matter how brilliant, but by the relentless pressure applied across the entire map. Hannibal had focused the world's attention on his personal duel with Rome. But while all eyes were on Italy, Rome was quietly, methodically, winning the war everywhere else. The promise of a second front shimmered like a mirage on the horizon. In the years following Cannae, Hannibal knew his window for a decisive strike was narrowing. To break the Roman system, he needed to multiply the pressure, to force its legions to defend not one frontier, but two. His gaze turned east across the Adriatic Sea, to the ambitious young king of Macedon, Philip V. Here was a ruler who saw Rome's distress as his own opportunity, a chance to expand his influence into the chaotic Western Balkans. A treaty was signed in 215 BC, a formal alliance between Carthage and Macedon against their common Roman foe. On paper, it was a masterstroke of grand strategy. Philip pledged to bring his formidable Macedonian phalanx to Italy, or at the very least to invade Roman-held territories in Illyria, forcing a major diversion of Roman troops and resources. For a moment, Hannibal's war was no longer a contained Italian problem. It was a Mediterranean-wide coalition. Yet this diplomatic triumph, so promising in its conception, would unravel into a case study in the immense difficulty of coordinating ancient warfare across vast distances. The Romans, masters of pragmatic adaptation, refused to panic. They did not rush their main armies from Italy to meet Philip. Instead, they applied a principle of minimal sufficient force. They forged alliances with Greek city-states hostile to Macedonian power, most notably the Aetolian League, and provided them with naval support and a small contingent of troops. This clever, low-cost approach ignited what historians call the First Macedonian War, a grinding, indecisive conflict that pinned Philip down in his own backyard. For the king, campaigning in the rugged hills of Greece became a more immediate and pressing concern than a risky naval expedition to a distant Italy. The promised second front dissolved into a distant, distracting sideshow. The challenges were immense. communication across the Adriatic was slow and perilous, subject to the whims of weather and Roman patrols. Coordinating the timing of offensives between Hannibal in Apulia and Philip in Thessaly was practically impossible, and crucially, the Romans understood the nature of the threat. They prioritized containing Philip with a limited war, accepting a stalemate in Greece to preserve their focus on the existential threat in Italy. Hannibal's brilliant diplomatic chess move was met not with a panicked scramble, but with a calm, calculated countermove that neutralized its power. The alliance with Macedon highlighted a painful truth. Hannibal could win battles and forge treaties, but Rome controlled the sea and possessed a strategic patience that could turn even a king's ambition into a contained, manageable problem. The Grand Coalition had failed to materialize, leaving the Carthaginian general to fight on, increasingly alone, against an enemy that was learning to fight a different kind of war. While Hannibal roamed Italy and Rome secured Spain, another theater of war ignited, one where intellect itself became a weapon. The great Greek city of Syracuse on the island of Sicily, a jewel of culture and learning, had been a Roman ally. But after the shock of Cannae, its young ruler, King Hieronymus, saw Carthage as the rising power and switched sides. His assassination soon after plunged the city into chaos, but a pro-Carthaginian faction ultimately took control, formally breaking its treaty with Rome. This was not a minor rebellion. Syracuse was a wealthy, fortified port, and its defection threatened Roman control of the entire island and the vital sea lanes around it. The Senate could not let this stand. They dispatched one of their finest commanders, the hardened veteran Marcus Claudius Marcellus, with orders to take the city back. What awaited him there, however, was not a conventional garrison, but the mind of an old man who thought in geometries and levers. The defender was Archimedes, perhaps the greatest mathematician and engineer of the ancient world. He was not a soldier, but a citizen called upon to save his home. He turned the very walls of Syracuse into a laboratory for defense, designing and constructing a terrifying array of war machines that seemed to bend the laws of physics. When the mighty Roman fleet approached the seaward walls, confident in its naval supremacy, it was met with a nightmare. Giant cranes, operated by hidden counterweights and pulleys, swung out over the battlements. These mechanical arms dropped massive iron claws or hooks onto the ships below, seizing their prows. Then, with a terrifying display of leverage, the cranes would heave upwards, lifting the bow of the ship clear out of the water before releasing it, causing the vessel to capsize or smash back into the sea. Other contraptions hurled showers of heavy stones with devastating accuracy. The most legendary device, though debated by historians, was the so-called burning mirror, a polished array of shields or bronze plates said to focus the sun's rays into a searing beam to set sails ablaze. Whether this specific weapon was real or a later embellishment, the principle was clear. Archimedes had turned science into a force multiplier, making the walls themselves alive with calculated destructive force. Marcellus and his legions were baffled and battered. Every conventional assault by land or by sea was met with an ingenious and humiliating rebuttal. The Roman soldiers, so disciplined in the open field, began to dread approaching the walls, whispering that they were fighting a geomancer who could command the very elements against them. The siege dragged on for nearly 2 years, from 214 to 212 BC. This was a massive drain on Roman resources, tying down an entire consular army and fleet that could have been deployed against Hannibal in Italy or reinforcing the campaign in Spain. The struggle at Syracuse became a powerful symbol, a demonstration that raw military power could be stymied, at least for a time, by sheer intellectual brilliance. It was a different kind of warfare, where levers and angles proved as formidable as legionary swords. Ultimately, however, the city's fate was sealed not by a failure of its defenses, but by a failure of vigilance. During a festival when the weary Syracusan guards were distracted after a night of celebration, a small Roman force scaled a poorly defended section of the outer wall and opened the gates. Marcellus's army poured in. Even in the final chaos, the legend of Archimedes endured. It is said he was so engrossed in a geometric diagram drawn in the sand that he failed to respond to a Roman soldier's order and was struck down, a mind that had moved worlds extinguished in a moment of brutal conquest. The fall of Syracuse was a Roman victory, but a costly and sobering one. It exemplified the sprawling, interconnected nature of this war. Every rebellion, every siege, from the hills of Spain to the walls of Syracuse, forced Rome to stretch its resources, to fight a multi-front conflict not of its choosing. For Hannibal, watching from Italy, each of these distant struggles meant one less Roman army he had to face directly, a slow bleeding of his enemy's strength even as his own strategic position gradually eroded. The war was no longer a duel, but a vast, grinding contest of endurance across the entire Mediterranean stage. Hannibal's battlefield victories were orchestrated long before the first spear was thrown. His true weapon was knowledge, a deep and intimate understanding of the enemy's mind. In an era without satellites or signals intelligence, he built a formidable human network, a web of scouts, local sympathizers, and spies that stretched across Italy. This network gave him something priceless, a clearer picture of the Roman army's movements than the Roman consuls often had of his. He did not just react to his enemy, he anticipated them because he understood the men who led them. Before the disaster at Lake Trasimene, his actions were a deliberate psychological script. By ravaging the lands Flaminius had championed, he was not merely seeking supplies, he was performing a calculated insult, a personal provocation he knew the proud consul could not ignore. He understood that Roman commanders, bred on a culture of aggressive honor, could be goaded into reckless pursuit. This was not a guess, it was a prediction based on a profile. His entire campaign in Italy was a masterclass in what we now call information warfare. He used feints and false marches to confuse and misdirect. He would light extra campfires at night to make his force appear larger, or abandon a fortified position suddenly to lure the Romans into a trap. Every move was designed to manipulate the information his opponents received, to shape their perception of reality until it aligned with his own strategic needs. This deep reading of command psychology allowed him to consistently set the terms of every engagement. He turned Roman strengths, like their relentless aggression and predictable formations, into their greatest vulnerabilities. The ambush at Trasimene, the funnel at Cannae, these were not just tactical formations on a map, they were the physical culmination of a deeper victory, the victory of knowing your enemy better than they knew themselves. In the end, Hannibal's brilliance was as much about perception as it was about position, proving that in war, the most important terrain is often the space between an enemy's ears. The Roman legionary, trained for close combat with sword and shield, often found himself facing an enemy he could not reach. Hannibal's greatest tactical edge moved on four legs, a living, breathing weapon system that turned the battlefield into a dynamic chessboard. At the heart of this advantage were the Numidian horsemen, riders from North Africa who seemed to be one with their small, agile mounts. They carried no heavy armor or lances, just a bundle of javelins and an intimate knowledge of the terrain. Their genius was in their style of combat, a constant, swirling dance of harassment. They would surge forward, unleash a volley of spears, and then wheel away before the slower Roman cavalry could close for a static fight. This was not about delivering a single, crushing blow. It was about control, about dictating the pace and flow of the battle's opening movements. They were Hannibal's eyes and his swift, stinging fists, perfect for scouting, screening his army's movements, and dismantling an enemy's cavalry before the main lines even met. But cavalry alone does not win battles, it enables victories. Hannibal's true innovation was how he wove these fast-moving units into the very fabric of his battle plans, creating a devastating combined arms doctrine that the Romans were painfully slow to understand. His most famous application of this was the classic hammer and anvil tactic, a symphony of pressure and timing. In this scheme, his reliable infantry center, often his Gallic and Iberian warriors, played the role of the anvil. Their job was not to win, but to hold, to fix the massive Roman infantry mass in place, absorbing its tremendous forward momentum. Meanwhile, his cavalry, particularly his heavier Iberian and Celtic horsemen supported by the nimble Numidians, served as the hammer. Their mission was to win the fight on the flanks with shocking speed, to scatter the Roman cavalry not by chasing them off the field, but by destroying them as a cohesive force. Once this was achieved, they did not pause. They reformed and, in a decisive, sweeping maneuver, turned inward and charged directly into the rear of the Roman legions, who were already deeply engaged with the anvil to their front. The effect was catastrophic. The Roman soldier, trained to face forward, now found himself attacked from behind, his formation compressed with nowhere to go. The hammer met the anvil, and what was caught between was shattered. This was the masterstroke at Cannae in microcosm, but the principle applied everywhere. Hannibal treated his army not as a single blunt instrument, but as a toolkit. Each type of troop, from the skirmishing Numidians to the steadfast African veterans, had a specialized role, and their movements were choreographed to support one another. The Roman legions, for all their discipline, were primarily an infantry machine. They struggled to counter an enemy who refused to fight a static battle of lines, an enemy who could strike with overwhelming force at their most vulnerable point from a direction they never expected. The cavalry advantage was more than just having better horsemen. It was about having a commander who knew exactly how to use them to transform a local success on the flank into a total victory across the entire field. While Rome built a stronger wall, Hannibal mastered the art of moving around it. The very methods that brought Rome to its knees became the blueprint for its future invincibility. In a profound historical irony, Hannibal's greatest legacy was not the empire he nearly toppled, but the superpower he ultimately helped forge. The Romans were not sentimental about defeat. They were ruthlessly pragmatic students. The staggering losses at the Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and Cannae were not just tragedies to be mourned. They were brutal, expensive lessons to be analyzed and absorbed. This forced a painful but comprehensive evolution in Roman military thinking, a revolution born from humiliation. They began to move away from the dense, monolithic phalanx-style formations that had been so easily surrounded. The legion evolved into a more flexible system of maniples, smaller blocks of troops that could operate more independently, pivot to meet threats from the flanks, and maneuver on broken ground. They invested heavily in improving their own cavalry, recruiting from allied nations with equestrian traditions, and striving to match the tactical agility they had witnessed firsthand. Most importantly, they institutionalized the strategic patience of Fabius Maximus. The doctrine of avoiding decisive battle against a superior operational commander became a valid tool in the Roman arsenal, no longer seen as cowardice but as calculated prudence. This learning curve culminated in the generation of commanders who finally ended the war. Foremost among them was Publius Cornelius Scipio, later called Africanus. As a young man, he had witnessed the catastrophe at Cannae and survived. He did not just remember the fear, he studied the battle, reverse engineering Hannibal's masterpiece. He understood the principles of maneuver, the decisive use of cavalry, and the psychological manipulation of an opponent. When Scipio faced Hannibal himself on the plains of Zama in North Africa, the pupil confronted the master. There, Scipio deployed a refined Roman version of the double envelopment, using his own superior cavalry to clear the field and set the stage for a crushing infantry engagement. Hannibal was defeated by a reflection of his own genius, a mind that had learned every lesson his brilliance could teach. In striving to break the Roman war machine, Hannibal had instead provided it with the most advanced education imaginable. His campaigns became the essential textbook, the case study that transformed the Roman legion from a powerful but rigid force into the adaptable, relentless instrument that would build an empire. The man who sought to erase Rome from history inadvertently wrote the manual for its future conquests. The Roman response to genius was not just a change in tactics, but the rise of a man who could think like his enemy. While Hannibal remained a contained storm in Italy, a young Roman named Publius Cornelius Scipio was quietly studying his every move, preparing to turn the Carthaginians' own artistry against him. Scipio's connection to this war was deeply personal and tragic. His father and uncle, the commanders who had fought so long to hold Iberia, had both fallen in battle there. Instead of retreating into grief, Scipio, then only in his mid-20s, stepped forward to request command of the shattered Spanish front. The Senate, desperate and perhaps seeing a spark of destiny in him, agreed. He arrived in Iberia not to continue a grinding war of attrition, but to end it. His first move was a masterstroke of audacity that would have made Hannibal proud. Instead of confronting the main Carthaginian armies, he marched his legions at lightning speed toward their primary supply base, the heavily fortified port city of Carthago Nova, modern Cartagena. The city was considered impregnable, connected to the mainland only by a narrow isthmus and protected by a lagoon. Local fishermen revealed to Scipio a crucial secret, that at low tide, the waters in the lagoon receded to a shallow depth. That night, under cover of darkness, Scipio launched a coordinated assault. While his main force attacked the landward walls, he sent a contingent wading silently through the chilly, waist-deep water of the lagoon to scale the seemingly unguarded seaward defenses. The Carthaginian garrison, overwhelmed from two sides, fell quickly. In one bold strike, Scipio captured the enemy's treasury, their arsenal, and a vital harbor. This was more than a military victory, it was a declaration. Scipio was demonstrating a new Roman way of war, one built on superior intelligence, rapid movement, and psychological shock. He understood Hannibal's core principle: to fight the war where the enemy is weak, not where he is strong. By securing Iberia, Scipio severed Hannibal's lifeline. But his strategic vision looked even further. He recognized that the only way to break the stalemate in Italy was to make Carthage itself feel the terror of invasion. After securing Spain, he returned to Rome and argued for a radical shift to carry the war directly to Africa. This was a controversial and frightening proposal, to leave the homeland exposed to Hannibal while launching an overseas invasion. Yet Scipio prevailed. He landed in North Africa not to conquer Carthage immediately, but to systematically dismantle its alliances and ravage its countryside, mirroring exactly what Hannibal had done to Italy for 15 years. The psychological and political pressure was instantaneous. The Carthaginian Senate, seeing their own fields burn, panicked. They issued the desperate recall Hannibal had always dreaded. The legendary general was forced to abandon his hard-won position in Italy and sail home to defend his city, leaving behind a campaign that had never truly been defeated on the battlefield. He would now face Scipio on open plains near Zama, but the strategic advantage had irrevocably shifted. Scipio had not outfought Hannibal in Italy. He had outthought him on the map, forcing the master of operational art to fight a battle he did not choose at a time and place of Rome's selection. In Scipio, Rome proved it could learn, adapt, and finally produce a mind that could not only comprehend genius but counter it. The recall from Carthage was a bitter homecoming. After 15 years of undefeated brilliance on Italian soil, Hannibal sailed away from the war he had defined, summoned back to a city now facing the very terror he had tried to inflict on Rome. He arrived in North Africa in 203 BC, not as a returning hero with a victorious army, but as a strategist handled a desperate, last-minute puzzle. The stage for the final confrontation was a plain near Zama, and the date was 202 BC. Here, the two masterminds would finally meet, but the symmetry was an illusion. The strategic world had been turned upside down. Hannibal was no longer the patient hunter with a veteran corps. He was now scrambling to assemble a force, a mix of raw Carthaginian levies, hastily recalled mercenaries, and a contingent of his own legendary but weary Italian veterans. He was, for the first time, building an army under the pressure of an imminent threat, not crafting one over years of careful campaigning. His opponent, Publius Cornelius Scipio, stood across the field in a position of surreal familiarity. He commanded a Roman army tempered by years of successful campaigning in Iberia and Africa, a force confident and cohesive. More crucially, Scipio had achieved a diplomatic coup that stripped away Hannibal's greatest historical advantage. He had secured the allegiance of the Numidian king Maximus, a former Carthaginian ally. This brought thousands of the world's finest light cavalry directly into the Roman order of battle. For the first time in a major engagement, Hannibal would face a Roman commander who not only matched his tactical understanding, but who also possessed superior cavalry. The chessboard was set, but one player had lost his most powerful piece before the first move was made. The battle itself was a strange and tense echo of Cannae, a reflection seen in a dark mirror. Hannibal, ever the realist, knew his new infantry could not match the Roman legions in maneuver. He arranged them in three distinct lines, a formation of calculated depth over flexibility. In front, he placed his mercenaries, behind them the citizen militia of Carthage, and in the rear, held in reserve, his priceless and irreplaceable veterans from Italy, the men who had crossed the Alps with him. His plan was brutally straightforward: to use his first two lines as a massive shock absorber, to blunt and exhaust the Roman infantry advance. Then, once the legions were tired and disordered, he would unleash his hardened veterans in a decisive counterstroke. It was a defensive masterplan, a testament to his ability to craft a viable strategy even with inferior tools. Scipio, however, was not a consul like Varro or Flaminius, eager to charge headlong into the trap. He understood the geometry of the formation before him. He deployed his own legions in a novel way, not in the traditional three continuous lines, but with wide lanes left between the maniples. This was not a formation for a head-on collision. It was a formation designed to neutralize Hannibal's secret weapon, his 80 war elephants. As the Carthaginian line advanced, Scipio's trumpeters let out a sudden, deafening blast. The noise and strange Roman formation spooked the elephants. Many of the great beasts panicked, turning aside and trampling through Hannibal's own cavalry on the wings, causing chaos from the very start. Others were funneled harmlessly down the lanes Scipio had left open, passing through the Roman ranks without breaking them. With this single, ingenious adaptation, Scipio nullified what was meant to be the opening shock of the battle. The infantry clash that followed was grim and brutal, exactly as Hannibal had predicted. His first two lines fought hard but were gradually pushed back by the disciplined Roman advance. Yet the retreat was not a clean one. The lines began to intermingle, creating confusion. At this critical moment, the battle was decided on the flanks, just as it had been at Cannae, but with the roles reversed. Scipio's cavalry, now featuring Maximus's superb Numidians, routed their Carthaginian counterparts, but instead of chasing them off the field, they did what Hannibal's horsemen had done so many times before. They regrouped and wheeled to strike the rear of the Carthaginian army. The hammer blow fell just as Hannibal was committing his veteran reserve. His finest troops now found themselves pressed from the front by the Roman infantry and assaulted from behind by the Roman and Numidian cavalry. They fought with the skill and desperation of men who had survived 100 battles, but the tactical enclosure was complete. the pupil had executed the master's signature move with flawless precision. The Battle of Zama was not a repeat of Cannae, it was its answer. The long war ended not with a clever ambush or a stunning surprise, but with the cold, hard application of a learned principle, backed by better resources and fought on favorable terms. Hannibal's strategic brilliance had finally met a force it could not outthink, an enemy that had learned every lesson he had to teach. Hannibal's 3 lines were a fortress of desperation, each tier a testament to the army he now commanded. His war elephants, those legendary beasts that had crossed the Alps, thundered forward as the opening move, a living battering ram meant to shatter Roman discipline before the infantry even met. But Scipio had not spent years studying Hannibal's victories in vain. He had anticipated this very moment. Instead of a solid wall of shields, Scipio arranged his legionaries in unusual columns with wide, open lanes between them. As the elephants charged, the Romans raised a deafening blast of trumpets and horns. The sudden noise and the strange, gaping formation confused the animals. Many panicked, wheeling to trample through their own Carthaginian cavalry on the wings. Others, driven forward, found themselves funneled directly into those empty lanes, rushing harmlessly through the Roman ranks as soldiers parted to let them pass, then closed up again seamlessly. With a simple, brilliant adaptation, Scipio turned Hannibal's greatest psychological weapon into a source of chaos for the Carthaginian side alone. What followed was a grinding, brutal contest of infantry, exactly as Hannibal had planned. His first 2 lines, the mercenaries and the citizen levy, fought with determination but were slowly, inexorably pushed back by the relentless pressure of the Roman legions. The lines compressed and intermingled, a seething mass of men where order began to fray. Then came the moment for Hannibal's masterstroke. His hardened veterans from Italy, held in reserve, advanced to deliver the decisive counterpunch. Yet at that very instant, the true echo of Cannae arrived, not from the Carthaginian side, but from the Roman. Scipio's cavalry, now led by the formidable Numidian king Massinissa, had routed their Carthaginian opposites. But instead of chasing them to the horizon, they did exactly what Hannibal's horsemen had done so famously years before. They wheeled around, reformed, and charged directly into the rear of the Carthaginian army. Hannibal's veterans, the best soldiers in the world, now found themselves pressed from the front by Scipio's infantry and assaulted from behind by a whirlwind of Roman and Numidian lances. The enclosure was complete. The tactic that had shattered Rome at Cannae was now used to shatter Carthage at Zama. The pupil had not only learned the master's lesson, he had perfected its delivery. The defeat was total and definitive, ending the war in a single afternoon. Hannibal's strategic brilliance, which had danced around Roman armies for 15 years, met its final, sobering truth that no tactic, however brilliant, is immortal once an opponent truly understands it. Zama was the final, decisive answer to a question Hannibal had posed for 17 years. Yet his ultimate failure was not a sudden collapse, but the slow, inevitable result of a brilliant strategy built on fragile foundations. His campaign stands as the classic study in the crucial difference between operational brilliance and strategic success. He won nearly every major battle but lost the war, a paradox that reveals the limits of military genius when it operates in a political vacuum. First and foremost, his grand political calculation simply failed to materialize. Hannibal wagered that the shock of his victories, especially the catastrophe at Cannae, would shatter Rome's network of Italian allies. He believed these conquered peoples would see him as a liberator and rise up en masse, isolating the city of Rome completely. While important cities like Capua did defect, providing him a winter headquarters and prestige, the widespread, cascading revolt he needed never happened. The core of the Confederation held firm. Why? Because Rome's control was not maintained by fear alone. It was reinforced by a tangible system of benefits, shared spoils from earlier conquests, protected trade, and the gradual extension of citizenship to local elites. For many communities, breaking faith with Rome meant gambling their stable, profitable future on the uncertain promise of a foreign general. Hannibal understood how to break an army's formation, but he misjudged the stronger bonds of vested interest and perceived security. This political miscalculation was compounded by Rome's two greatest strategic assets, its deep manpower reserves and its resilient alliance system. After each devastating defeat, Rome could and did raise new legions. The loss at Cannae, while horrific, was not existential because the Republic could draw on a vast pool of citizen soldiers and loyal allied troops. The war became a brutal arithmetic. Hannibal's army was a masterpiece, but it was also irreplaceable. Every veteran spearman or skilled cavalryman lost was a permanent subtraction. Rome, in contrast, could afford the grim exchange, trading soldiers for time, slowly wearing down the sharpened edge of Carthage's finest instrument. Furthermore, Rome's allies provided not just soldiers, but supplies, intelligence, and secure bases. Hannibal, operating deep in enemy territory, had to constantly forage, a necessity that often alienated the very populations he hoped to win over, blurring the line between liberation and occupation. His position was further crippled by a critical failure back home. Carthage itself never fully committed to his grand design. The merchant aristocracy that dominated the Senate was often hesitant, more concerned with protecting trade routes and their own wealth than with funding a total war in distant Italy. This lack of unified political will translated into inadequate logistical support. Most crucially, Carthage failed to secure control of the sea. The Roman navy dominated the Mediterranean, severing the supply lines between North Africa and Italy. This meant reinforcements, funds, and official directives could only reach Hannibal in unreliable trickles, if at all. He was left to sustain his campaign largely on his own, a spectacularly skilled commander, slowly bleeding his only army dry against an enemy that could regenerate. Finally, and perhaps most decisively, Rome proved it could learn. The rise of Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus was the embodiment of this adaptation. Scipio did not simply try to outfight Hannibal, he studied him. He reverse-engineered the principles of his operational art, the rapid movement, the psychological manipulation, the decisive use of cavalry, and then applied them on a larger strategic canvas. By conquering Iberia, Scipio severed Hannibal's resource base. By invading Africa, he shifted the theater of war and forced Carthage to recall its greatest general. At Zama, he demonstrated he had internalized the lessons of Cannae, using Hannibal's own tactical blueprint to secure victory. In Scipio, Rome produced a commander who could think on the same level, neutralizing genius not with brute force, but with refined understanding. Hannibal's story, therefore, is a profound testament to the limits of victory defined solely on the battlefield. He was a master of the operational art, capable of movements and battles that are still studied in military academies. Yet he lacked a viable political endgame for after the battles were won. He had no clear path to actually capture the city of Rome with its massive walls, and he could not break the political and social system that kept the Republic resilient. His focus was on defeating Roman armies, but he never found a way to defeat the Roman idea. In the end, his campaign highlights a timeless strategic truth that lasting success requires more than winning battles. It requires the political vision to consolidate those victories, the logistical foundation to sustain them, and an understanding that an enemy, especially one as stubborn as Rome, can adapt. His brilliance illuminated the art of war, but its limits revealed the deeper architecture of power. The dust of Zama settled over a broken Carthage. The treaty Rome imposed was not merely a peace agreement, it was a deliberate dismantling of a rival's power, crafted to ensure Carthage could never threaten Rome again. The terms were crushing. Carthage was forced to pay a war indemnity of 10,000 talents of silver, an astronomical sum that would cripple its treasury for decades. Its once proud navy, the fleet that had ruled Mediterranean trade, was reduced to a mere 10 ships, barely enough for coastal patrol. All of its overseas territories, including the precious silver mines of Iberia, were forfeited to Rome. Most humiliating of all, Carthage was forbidden from waging any war, even in its own defense, without the explicit permission of the Roman Senate. The city was stripped of its empire, its military, and its sovereignty, reduced to a dependent client state in Rome's shadow. This was the price of challenging a superpower and losing. In a fascinating final chapter, Hannibal himself attempted to heal the wounds he had helped inflict. Returning to a Carthage now governed by the very merchant aristocrats who had often withheld support from his campaign, he entered politics. Elected as a suffete, a chief magistrate, he turned his formidable mind from military logistics to economic reform. He tackled corruption, streamlined the state's finances to manage the crushing Roman debt, and proved so effective that he restored Carthage's economic vitality with startling speed. Yet for Rome, a prosperous Carthage led by Hannibal was a nightmare they refused to tolerate. Roman envoys arrived, accusing him of conspiring with Eastern kings against Rome. Whether these accusations held truth or were pure fabrication born of paranoia mattered little. The message was clear: Hannibal's very existence was a threat to Roman peace. To avoid being seized and dragged through the streets of Rome in chains, he had no choice but to flee. In the dead of night, he slipped out of the city he had served his entire life, beginning a long, bitter exile. His final years were a wandering echo of his former life. He became a military advisor to kings in the Hellenistic East, serving Antiochus III of the Seleucid Empire and later rulers in Armenia and Bithynia. Wherever he went, Roman diplomats followed, their demands for his surrender poisoning every court he tried to call home. He was a ghost of his past self, a brilliant strategic mind forever looking over his shoulder, yet still capable of crafting clever plans for his new patrons in their conflicts with Rome's growing influence. He remained to his last breath the persistent thorn in Rome's side. The end came in the town of Libissa in Bithynia, around 182 BC. Surrounded by Roman agents sent to finally capture him, the man who had defied an empire for decades chose his own terms. He took poison, declaring, as one account tells us, that he would relieve the Romans of their long anxiety since they found it too tedious to wait for the death of an old man. It was a final act of defiance, a control over his own narrative that denied his enemies the ultimate satisfaction. His passing truly marked the end of an era. The great duelist was gone, and with him faded the last credible challenge to Rome's ascent in the Western Mediterranean. Carthage, hobbled and watched, would linger for another 5 decades before a paranoid Rome, remembering the trauma Hannibal had inflicted, would demand its utter destruction in the Third Punic War. But the true victory was already complete. By surviving its confrontation with Hannibal, Rome had been forged in fire. It had learned to adapt, to endure, and to project power across land and sea. The path to empire, once blocked by the brilliant shadow of a Carthaginian general, was now wide open and unstoppable. The strategic brilliance that had almost broken Rome did not vanish. Instead, it became the hidden cornerstone of the very empire it failed to stop. The man who became a legend was, in life, a master of the practical. Hannibal Barca exists in our cultural memory as 2 distinct figures. One is the historical commander, a man whose decisions are recorded in battle reports and political maneuvers. The other is the mythic archetype, the brilliant, tragic outsider who stood against an empire. To truly grasp his legacy, we must gently separate these threads, looking past the romantic brushstrokes applied over centuries to see the clearer portrait beneath. Roman historians, beginning with Polybius and Livy, established the foundational narrative. They could not ignore his military genius, but they consistently framed it within a moral context that served Roman identity. He was perfidious, treacherous, a man who broke oaths and employed deceit as a matter of course. This portrayal was less about documenting his character and more about defining Roman virtue by contrast. His cunning was highlighted not just as a tactic, but as a flaw, reinforcing the Roman ideal of direct, honorable confrontation. For Rome, he was the necessary villain whose greatness made their eventual victory all the more glorious. In the centuries that followed, as the Roman Empire itself faded into history, a fascinating reversal occurred. European poets, playwrights, and later Enlightenment thinkers began to recast Hannibal. No longer the perfidious Carthaginian, he became the romantic hero, the brilliant strategist doomed by the fickleness of his own government and the relentless machinery of Rome. He was the ultimate underdog, a figure of noble failure whose story spoke to themes of ambition, genius, and the cruel hand of fate. This romantic Hannibal is a compelling character, but he is a simplification, a figure stripped of the gritty, pragmatic realities that defined his actual campaign. So who was the real man behind these competing legends? Archaeological evidence, though scarce, and a critical reading of the historical sources point not to a mythical titan, but to a supremely adaptable and pragmatic leader. We see a commander who could inspire fierce loyalty not through mystical charisma, but through visible fairness and shared hardship. We see a politician who understood the power of alliance, marrying a Spanish princess to secure local loyalty. We see an administrator who, after the war, reformed Carthage's corrupt treasury to pay off the Roman war debt with stunning efficiency. This Hannibal was not driven by a singular, tragic obsession, but by a series of calculated decisions made in response to shifting circumstances. He adapted his strategy to the landscape, to his enemy's psychology, and to the painful limitations of his own supply lines. His decision not to march on Rome after Cannae, so often questioned as a fatal hesitation, was likely a cold assessment of military reality. His army lacked siege engines, and assaulting a fortified city with a garrison still intact would have been a costly gamble with his irreplaceable veterans. This was not the flaw of a tragic hero, it was the rational choice of a professional soldier. Understanding this real, pragmatic Hannibal makes his achievements far more compelling. His genius was not a supernatural gift, but the product of intense study, deep cultural understanding, and an unparalleled ability to synthesize information. It was human brilliance applied on a colossal scale. Similarly, his ultimate failure becomes not a poetic tragedy ordained by fate, but a sobering lesson in the limits of military power when it lacks a sustainable political and logistical foundation. By seeing him as a man, not a myth, we learn more. We see that history's most formidable challenges are not overcome by demigods, but by individuals who think, adapt, and persevere within the confines of their very real world. His legacy, therefore, is not just a tale of what almost was, but a masterclass in how to think under pressure, a study that remains profoundly instructive precisely because it is human, flawed, and real. The echoes of Hannibal's war are not trapped in ancient texts, they resonate in the strategies that shape our modern world. His campaign is far more than a historical curiosity. It is a living case study, a playbook of principles that remain startlingly relevant in boardrooms, political capitals, and military academies. Take his most famous act, the crossing of the Alps. This was not merely a physical journey, it was a masterstroke of psychological warfare, a deliberate assault on Roman expectations designed to paralyze them with shock and awe. In our era, we see this same principle in the opening moves of modern conflicts, where the goal is not just to defeat an enemy's army, but to shatter their will to fight through overwhelming and unexpected force. Hannibal understood that the most powerful weapon is often the idea you place in your opponent's mind. a lesson that applies to everything from corporate marketing launches to geopolitical deterrence. His genius for intelligence and deception feels ripped from today's headlines. Long before digital networks, Hannibal built a human web of scouts and local informants, giving him a clearer picture of the Roman army than the Roman consuls often had. He used feints, false marches, and misinformation to shape the reality his enemies perceived. This is the ancient blueprint for modern cyber and information warfare, where battles are fought not over hills and rivers, but over data streams and public perception. The goal remains identical: to know your enemy intimately while clouding their understanding of you, to attack their decision-making process before a single physical engagement begins. In an age of social media and constant digital footprints, Hannibal's emphasis on controlling the narrative is more critical than ever. Perhaps the most counterintuitive lesson comes from his greatest adversary, not from Hannibal himself, but from the Roman response. The Fabian strategy of avoidance, of refusing to give battle and instead starving the enemy of momentum, was initially seen as cowardice, yet it saved Rome. This is the ultimate lesson in strategic patience and the power of indirect approaches, especially in asymmetric conflicts. When facing a stronger or more brilliant opponent, the path to victory may not be through direct confrontation, but through endurance, through attacking support structures, and through outlasting their will. We see this in business when a startup avoids competing directly with a giant, instead carving out a niche the larger company ignores. We see it in modern insurgencies that focus not on winning battles, but on surviving long enough to make the conflict unsustainable for their opponent. Fabius taught us that sometimes the most powerful move is the one you do not make. Finally, Hannibal's ultimate failure is itself a profound textbook. He was a master of the operational art, winning stunning victories, yet he lost the war. Why? Because tactical ingenuity alone is never enough. His story underscores the non-negotiable pillars of any grand strategy: the unglamorous backbone of logistics, the essential web of political alliances, and the critical need for a clear, achievable end state. He could live off the land, but he could not replace his veteran corps. He could win battles, but he could not secure the lasting political defections needed to isolate Rome. He had a brilliant means but a vague end: the defeat of Rome, without a concrete plan for what came after. These are the very principles debated by CEOs launching global expansions and by generals planning campaigns. Success requires a holistic view where every brilliant maneuver is supported by supply chains, diplomatic outreach, and a definitive vision of what victory actually looks like. Hannibal's legacy, therefore, is not a relic, it is a mirror. It challenges us to look beyond the flash of immediate triumph and ask the harder questions about sustainability, support, and ultimate purpose, reminding us that the most brilliant path is worthless if it does not lead to a destination you can actually hold. The road to Rome lay open, but the gates remained shut. In the stunned silence following Cannae, the most famous question of the ancient world was born: why did Hannibal not march on the city itself? The Roman army in Italy was annihilated, its leadership decimated, and a wave of terror washed through the streets. To the survivors, it must have seemed the final hour had come. Yet the Carthaginian general turned his army away, choosing instead to consolidate his gains in southern Italy. This single decision has echoed through 22 centuries of debate, a pivot point where history might have bent in a completely different direction. To understand it is to move beyond simple myth and into the hard realities of ancient warfare. The consensus among historians is starkly practical. Marching on Rome and capturing it were two entirely different challenges. Hannibal's army, though victorious, was itself depleted and exhausted from the brutal fighting. More critically, it was an army built for maneuver and open battle, not for siegecraft. Rome's Servian walls were a formidable barrier of massive stone, and Hannibal possessed no dedicated siege engines, no towers or heavy battering rams needed to breach such defenses. A direct assault would have been a bloody, grinding affair against a city that still had a garrison and a desperate population willing to fight for every street. To storm Rome would have risked his entire veteran corps in a single, desperate gamble with no guarantee of success, so the immediate military logic was clear. But what if the conditions had been different? This is where the what-if scenarios become more than fantasy. They become a lens to examine the precise ingredients for total victory that Hannibal ultimately lacked. The first and most crucial alternate path involves politics. Hannibal's entire strategy was predicated on a grand political calculation that his victories would trigger a mass defection of Rome's Italian allies. What if, after Cannae, that calculation had been fully realized? Imagine not just Capua, but a cascade of central Italian cities throwing open their gates. This would have provided Hannibal with secure bases ringing Rome, a steady flow of local recruits to replenish his losses, and most importantly, it would have completely isolated the capital, cutting it off from the food and manpower of the countryside. A Rome alone, besieged not just by one army but by a hostile peninsula, becomes a very different problem. Its walls might hold, but its spirit and its stores would eventually fail. The second scenario hinges on sea power and political will back in Carthage. What if, in the wake of Cannae, the Carthaginian Senate had acted with unified, ruthless determination? What if they had controlled the sea lanes and managed to land a second major army, complete with engineers and siege trains on the coast of Italy? This reinforcement would have addressed Hannibal's two greatest weaknesses, his lack of specialist troops for assault and his dwindling numbers. With a fresh army to maintain pressure and properly equip a siege, the dynamic shifts dramatically. Rome, struggling to raise new legions from a terrified citizenry, would have faced a sustained, two-pronged offense if it likely could not withstand. Exploring these alternate histories is not about rewriting the past, but about illuminating the fine, brittle margins upon which history often balances. Hannibal came breathtakingly close to breaking Rome because he mastered the art of the battlefield. Yet to truly conquer it, he needed a convergence of factors beyond his direct control: unwavering political support from home, command of the sea, and the complete political collapse of the Roman Confederation. He achieved one of these partially with some allied defections, but the other two remained stubbornly out of reach, held firmly by Roman resilience and Carthaginian hesitation. His story, therefore, teaches us that the most brilliant operational plan can still falter against the harder, slower domains of logistics, diplomacy, and grand strategy. The man who could outthink every general on the field could not single-handedly command the tides of politics or the vastness of the sea. His name is etched not in the marble of a victor's monument, but in the granite of history's most profound lessons. Hannibal Barca's strategic brilliance carved a 15-year question into the bedrock of the ancient world, a question that asked if one mind, armed with nothing but audacity and insight, could topple an entire system of power. He answered it not with a single, fleeting victory, but with a sustained symphony of pressure, a campaign that tested the Roman Republic's foundations like no enemy before or since. His mastery was holistic. He saw the battlefield not as a flat plain, but as a three-dimensional puzzle where terrain, weather, and human psychology were pieces to be moved. He turned the frozen rivers of the Trebia into allies, the morning fog of Trasimene into a weapon, and the predictable pride of Roman consuls into the very trigger of their own destruction. In doing so, he set a standard for operational art that military academies still dissect, a timeless study in how to outthink, not just outfight, a superior force. Yet, the true weight of his story lies not in the brilliance of his victories, but in the sobering clarity of his ultimate limitation. Hannibal's campaign is history's great tragedy of the operational mind, a stark reminder that genius on the battlefield can still be encircled and neutralized by forces beyond its reach. He was checkmated not by a greater general for over a decade, but by the slower, deeper currents of institutional resilience, logistical reality, and a foe's stubborn will to adapt. Rome's greatest strength was not its legions, which he shattered repeatedly, but its ability to learn, to endure, and to transform humiliation into a blueprint for evolution. The Fabian strategy of delay, once scorned as cowardice, became a doctrine of survival. The Roman alliance system, though strained, did not fracture. And in Scipio Africanus, Rome finally produced a pupil who could think in his master's language, applying Hannibal's own principles on a global chessboard to force a final, decisive checkmate at Zama. In a profound historical irony, the man who sought to break Rome instead became the anvil upon which it was forged anew. The trauma he inflicted was a brutal education. The republic that emerged from the fire of the Second Punic War was harder, more adaptable, and strategically aware. It had learned the necessity of a professional navy, the value of flexible legionary formations, and the imperative of fighting wars across multiple theaters simultaneously. The path to empire, once a regional ambition, was now a Mediterranean destiny, cleared by the very challenge Hannibal presented. He almost broke Rome, and in doing so, he unintentionally tempered it into the unstoppable force that would dominate the ancient world for centuries. As we close this chapter, the echoes of Cannae and the Alps do not fade into silence. They resonate as a permanent conversation about the nature of power and strategy. They ask us what true victory requires, reminding us that it is a structure built on more than battlefield moments. It needs political vision, logistical depth, and an understanding that an enemy's greatest weakness may be their capacity to change. Hannibal's legacy, therefore, is not a simple tale of a hero or a villain, but a complex mirror. It reflects the breathtaking potential of human ingenuity when faced with impossible odds, and it also reflects the humbling boundaries that even the most brilliant mind must confront. His war teaches us that history's arc is shaped not by destiny alone, but by the relentless, grinding interplay of brilliant ideas against resilient systems, a lesson that continues to unfold in every arena where conflict and strategy meet.